So Bijan, can you tell me a little bit about how the private sector works in Iran? How large is it? How independent is it? Who are the owners? What's the nature of it?
Well, we don't have any clear statistics about the size of the private sector, but what you can do is by looking at the different sectors, economic sectors, where we do have statistics, and then gauging how much of each sector is actually private. For example, we have a 11 to 12% agricultural sector in Iran, 11 to 12% of the GDP, and that's mostly private farmers, private cooperatives who work in that sector. And if you do a calculation based on that, we have a large service sector which represents a lot of private sector players. If you do it based on that kind of a calculation, I would assume that 30 to maybe 35% of the Iranian economy, of the Iranian GDP is represented by the private sector. But the problem is that most of the private sector players in Iran, companies, firms, individuals, do rely on some sort of a license from the government, whether it's a license from a ministry or a license from even a cooperative to work within that cooperative. And those licenses create a lot of hurdles for the private sector. So they are private, they are privately owned, they make decisions themselves, but there is a degree of dependency on government licensing and so on. They are owned by a lot of individuals, obviously farmers, traders, shop owners, and so on. But when it comes to the industrial companies, manufacturing units, and so on, you do have large networks that usually group themselves around cities in Iran. So you have the Kerman network, you have the Yazd network, the Mashhad network. And they are quite established. They have their own local chambers of commerce that represents their interests. So they do operate, they have a working relationship with the government, but there are also a lot of issues and restrictions, as I said, licensing. There is the issue of competition with semi-state organizations, foundations, etc. So private sector is much more active than many believe in Iran, but it also faces a lot of restrictions.
Okay, I'll come back to that in a second, but I know that you've written in the past about the role that state organizations and that the Revolutionary Guard have played in privatization in Iran. Can you talk a little bit about the structure of ownership of private companies from your point of view?
So from my point of view, actually, I focused my research on the Tehran Stock Exchange and the way that large companies were supposedly privatized in the 90s and then more so in noughties, 2000s. The issue is that while it was supposed to be total transfer of ownership from the state ownership to private ownership, very often what happened was that the stocks were transferred, ownership was transferred from the state to players that I cannot in clear conscience call private sector. There are semi-state structures, many of them somehow dependent either on the big foundations in the country or to Revolutionary Guards, which actually entered the economy to a large extent beginning in late 90s. Now, the issue is that what is the goal that we have for privatization? Usually it is that you want to streamline the company such that it becomes more efficient, it becomes more productive, and it actually creates value. The problem that I witnessed, along with my co-author, was that when we actually started looking at the changes that were made to the boards, whether it's the directors, was it the board of directors, was it the CEOs, generally the high-ranking officers within these companies, we didn't see a whole lot of change such that old faces go and new faces come in.
So privatization didn't bring about much change in the way the companies operate.
Yes, and particularly in the case of Revolutionary Guards, whenever they took over a company, you usually saw that some civil citizens were actually fired, and then Revolutionary Guards generals replaced them, which most management gurus would not consider the best move to actually increase the productivity or the profitability of a company. Now, that said, the other issue that actually hamstrings these companies from below is that as part of privatization across the globe, you try to rejuvenate your labor force. Typically, what happens is that you get rid of some workers that are less productive and you hire more productive labor. That also is extremely difficult in the Iranian context because of the labor law. So we also didn't see a whole lot of that. To some extent, I can say that the privatization was less about transferring ownership from state to private sector, more about changing the faces and essentially creating a buffer between state and managers that were already affiliated with the state.
Can I comment on that? I think I agree that the privatization process was not actually originally designed to transfer control to the private sector. You can even see that in the fact that by law, 20% of the shares of any privatized company will remain with the state anyhow. And then there are a number of companies where 20%, a 20% share block would actually go to the so-called justice shares scheme, which are for lower income classes. So, and obviously those justice shares are also represented by the government. So you have a privatized, supposedly privatized company where 40% of the shares are controlled by the government. And even if the genuine private sector would come in, the two most significant board seats would be controlled by the government. So you can't really expect the changes that you were talking about. I agree with that. But I think what happened in Iran, which was significant, was that parallel to privatization, when it became clear that some sectors can be privatized and the private sector can play a role, we saw the phenomenon of emerging private sector initiatives in banking.
So a real private sector.
Real private sector. So I always say the private sector did not gain from the privatization process per se, but it gained from the new atmosphere and the new situation in the market. And so we do have genuine private sector companies, banks, insurance
but
firms.
they're still under different kinds of government controls. And they still...
Not all of them. Some of them may be affiliated or may be partners with semi-state organizations or with government organizations with, for example, pension funds. We have now a phenomenon of huge pension funds that are on paper considered private, but they're again controlled by the government. I mean, I always say, ask yourself who appoints the chairman of that organization. It's always
that's
the
a big question.
Yeah,
always.
exactly.
But can I actually interject in something
Sure,
that you said
sure.
about that? Correct. We have private companies that actually use this opening and enter the market. However, whether it is written or unwritten, I have essentially empirical evidence that the government very closely monitors the private sector. So, in effect, 10 years, 15 years after the banking sector has opened up and there are new banks that actually entered as form of private banks, still the largest banks in the country are state-owned banks. And there seems at least that there is an unwritten rule that you cannot get too big, you can't get too powerful. I believe that there is some evidence for that. Can you comment on it?
Sure. I mean, I would distinguish between the governments. I would say the Ahmadinejad government had an attitude that it didn't want private independent companies to become very powerful. In the case of banks, it's very clear. I mean, at the end of the day, in a cash-based economy like Iran, you need to work with banks that have a lot of branches across the country.
Naturally.
Most of the private sector banks, private banks, don't have a lot of branches. They don't even have the capital to have a lot of branches. So even if private sector companies wanted to work a lot with private banks, they would still need to go to the government-owned banks because of the thousands of branches.
So in effect, they don't have access to capital.
They don't have access to capital, and also it may not be their priority. I mean, some of the private banks have invested more in online banking than in branch and sort of street banking. But this is just one thing. But the key point that you are making is correct. The Ahmadinejad government, in my view, restricted the growth of genuine private sector companies. I am hopeful that the new government will be different, especially because the private sector is represented in the new government. Mr. Nahavandian is the sort of the president of the Iran Chamber of Commerce, is also the chief of staff now. So there is a clear influence, clear footprint of the private sector in the new government. We will have to see whether the situation will change, but it is definitely a very difficult environment for the private sector to operate.
At our conference today, there were many people who disagreed with this point, who thought that without deeper political changes, it would be hard. It's hard to imagine a flourishing private sector in Iran because of government desire to maintain control. What do you think?
Well, there is at least one episode in the recent Iranian history that something similar was taking place, and it was, some might say, violently suppressed. So in 1997, when Mr. Khatami got elected, his campaign was largely bankrolled by real estate developers in several cities, several large cities. And then right after that episode, many of these people were formally charged for embezzlement, tax evasion, the usual charges. Some of them might have been true. But they were not prosecuted up to that point, and a few of them were made an example of, and particularly some official figures, high-ranking officials, went on record of saying that we won't allow a new economic power base or a new class to form within the economy, within the country. I hope that this time is different, but the experience, at least from mid-90s, points in a different direction.
Thank you very much. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.